Hi everyone, my name is Neil Morrissey, and welcome to my course, Deploying ASP.NET Core to Azure App Services. I'm a solutions architect and a .NET developer. Azure App Service is Microsoft's platform as a service offering for hosting web applications and APIs. There are a lot of different ways to deploy your applications onto the platform and leverage the features of app services. In this course, we're going to look at all those different approaches, and you're going to learn about features of App Service, Azure DevOps, and GitHub along the way. Some of the major topics that we'll cover include an introduction to Azure App Services, including features for development like deployment slots, authentication, and troubleshooting tools. Different approaches to manual deployments, like deploying from Visual Studio or using FTP and zip deploy. You'll learn how to set up continuous deployment as part of your DevOps process, using GitHub Actions and Azure DevOps pipelines. And you'll learn about deploying database changes along with your ASP.NET Core applications. By the end of this course, you'll know all about the different ways to deploy your applications to Azure App Services. Before beginning this course, you should be familiar with building web applications using ASP.NET Core. I hope you'll join me on this journey to learn about deploying ASP.NET Core applications to Azure App Services, here at Pluralsight. Welcome to this course on deploying ASP.NET Core applications to Azure App Services. Before we start, let's talk about versions of the technologies used for this course. This course was created using sample applications that use these versions of ASP.NET Core and Visual Studio Community Edition, which is a free download from Microsoft. But this course isn't focused on code so much. It's more about the capabilities of Azure App Service and the tooling used to deploy code to it. So the course applies to older versions of ASP.NET Core. It also applies to older versions of Visual Studio. The course uses cloud technologies, which are always being updated, like Azure App Service, Azure DevOps Pipelines, and GitHub Actions. So you might see some screen differences here and there, but any major changes to those technologies will get updated in the course here. Okay, now let's get into the course. App Service is Microsoft's platform as a service offering for hosting HTTP-based solutions, like web applications, REST APIs, and function apps. Web apps, of course, are the web front ends that you build in ASP.NET Core. And API apps are essentially the same thing, but they don't provide a user interface. They're the web services in your larger solution. And they're based on the REST protocol, which basically means that the services are available using any of the standard HTTP methods of GET for querying, POST for creating, PUT for updating, and DELETE for, well, deleting. So a web API could be the web backend for JavaScript single-page applications, or the backend for mobile applications on devices. The API is then responsible for managing data in a central database for all of the distributed users of your solution. Or you might deploy web APIs as part of a microservices solution, where each API can scale independently. Azure App Service gives you the platform to host those web apps and APIs. Another type of application that app services can host are function apps. Function apps are just blocks of code that can run without an entire application infrastructure. You can just deploy the function code and have it respond to different types of events, like HTTP calls, timer events, or changes to a file or a database record. You can host function apps on Azure App Service, but function apps can actually be created in Azure outside of an app service, using a consumption-based model, where you only incur cost when the function runs. Running function apps on App Service is just a way of leveraging an existing app service that you might have provisioned for your other web apps and API apps, so you're already paying for the underlying infrastructure. In terms of deployment, the focus of this course will just be dealing with deploying web applications and APIs. If you're familiar with cloud concepts, you might have seen this diagram in some form or another. These are the cloud service models that show how much of the underlying infrastructure you're responsible for, depending on the type of cloud service you choose to host your applications on. With infrastructure as a service, these are virtual machines that you host in the cloud. Azure lets you select from templates for various operating systems, and some templates come with the middleware already installed. You get full access to the operating system on these virtual machines, but you're also responsible for configuring and patching everything, from the operating system through to the middleware, any runtimes you might need, like .NET or .NET Core, as well as the data and code for your applications. Azure helps with some of these tasks. For example, there's some automation that can help with patching the operating system, but ultimately, it's your responsibility. Azure App Service belongs to the Platform as a Service category, which means that Microsoft manages the operating system on the virtual machines. They manage the middleware, so the web server, the .NET Core runtime. All of those elements are handled for you. They are patched for security and kept updated to the latest versions. All you need to do is deploy your application code and any data to the platform. And by data here, I mean resources for your application. Databases aren't deployed directly to App Service. There are separate services in Azure for hosting databases, including Platform as a Service offerings, like Azure SQL Database. We'll look at deploying databases with your code in the last module of this course. Just for completeness, let's talk about the third cloud service model, Software as a Service. These are actually applications that you can use right away, like Office 365, SharePoint, or Dynamics 365. Often, you can do a lot of configuration in these apps and customize them to solve business problems. But you're limited to the constraints of the application. You can't build anything you want, like you can with ASP.NET Core. So in this module, we're going to look at Azure App Service before we start deploying ASP.NET Core applications onto app services in subsequent modules. First, I'll give you an overview of some of the features of app services. And we'll be discussing app service plans, which are the underlying virtual machine infrastructure that the app service runs on. The app service plan you choose decides the size and cost of the virtual machines your app service runs on, as well as what features are available. We'll create an app service plan, then an app service hosted on the app service plan. Then we'll look in more detail at some of the features of app services that relate to deployment, like deployment slots for hosting development and production versions of your applications on the same app service. We'll look at authenticating to the app service to deploy code, as well as authentication for users of your apps. We'll look at the Kudu portal, which gives you insight into the underlying infrastructure and provides some options for deployment. We'll also look at some of the logging options to help you when you run into issues with deployment. So let's start by discussing features of Azure App Service. Azure App Service is Microsoft's fully managed platform for hosting, deploying, and scaling web apps. You can host apps built in a variety of languages. There's ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core, of course, but you can also deploy apps written in Java, PHP, Node.js, and Python. And you can even host your own custom container images. If you have applications that run on a platform not natively supported by App Service, like Ruby, for example, then containers are always an option. An Azure App Service is a deployed instance of a website or web API, or a function app. So it's the published code for your website, for example. The app service is accessed over HTTP using a URL, and that can be a default URL, which is your appservicename.azurewebsites.net. Or you can assign a custom URL, which you can purchase through Azure, or purchase through any domain registrar and point it to the IP address or default domain name of your app service. You host your app service on an app service plan, which is a separate resource in Azure that needs to be created. The app service plan defines whether the underlying virtual machines are Windows-based or Linux. But it also defines the number of virtual machines used and the size of those VMs in terms of processor and memory. Remember, the management of those VMs is handled for you by Azure, but you still get a lot of control over configuring features of the environment, and you'll see that throughout this module. The app service plan also defines where those servers are located, in which Azure region in the world. You can host multiple app services on a single app service plan, and the number depends on the pricing tier that you choose for your app service plan. You'll see pricing tiers when we create an app service plan. So ease of management is the first benefit of using Azure App Service. But App Service has a lot of features and benefits for administrators and developers. Let's talk about some of the hosting features. When you have an app service plan hosting app services, you can scale out the environment to handle increased or decreased load. So let's say you have an app service plan that has a maximum number of virtual machine instances that you can scale out to. You decide that you'll configure your app service plan to use 3 virtual machines. If you expect a period where more users will be coming to your site, you can add more servers to handle the load and remove those servers later, so you don't end up paying for a lot of extra infrastructure that you don't need. And you can even automate that scaling using a feature called Autoscale, where you set the minimum and maximum number of VM instances, and then add and remove servers based on a schedule or based on metrics that you define, like how much memory or CPU is being used by the servers. So you can respond to changing demand automatically. Adding and removing services is called scaling out your app service. And if you find you need more powerful web servers, in terms of CPU and memory, you can also scale up your app service plan. You do this manually, though, by choosing a new app service plan pricing tier. So this is a huge benefit of Azure App Service. It's possible to start small and scale up or scale out when you need more resources later, and then scale back when you no longer need those resources, which saves you money. Think about how much more involved that would be on-premises, where you need to move your apps to more powerful web servers, or deploy your app to more web servers and add those web servers to the load balancer. Let's talk about load balancing with app services. When you're running multiple web servers in your app service plan, you get built-in load balancing. You don't need to configure anything. But if you migrate an application to app services that stores user state on the web server, you can enable session affinity, so users are directed back to the same server. For more advanced app publishing and to load balance across Azure regions, you can integrate App Service with other Azure services like Traffic Manager and Azure Front Door. Let's talk about some more hosting features before we get into features more related to developers in the next clip. You can back up and restore your app and configuration information to an Azure storage account, either manually or on a schedule. And you can even include databases that the app uses. That can all be configured from right within the Azure portal. I mentioned that your app gets a default domain when you create it, but you can add your own custom domains, and you can attach an SSL certificate to those domains. You can use your own certificate, or Azure can provide a free managed certificate for your custom domain. There are some limitations for the free certificates, of course, like it doesn't support wildcard certificates, and they aren't exportable. App Service Plan includes a lot of security and networking features that let you define how your app services can be accessed and what those app services are allowed to access. By default, apps hosted in App Service are accessible directly from the internet. Of course, you can require users to authenticate to your app service, and we'll talk more about that later in this module. But there's no restriction on reaching the app service, but you can enable IP-based access restriction rules, whereby traffic is only allowed to reach your app service if it comes from IP addresses that you allow. You can also set up service endpoints, so traffic is only allowed if it's coming from virtual networks in Azure that you specify. You might do this if you want virtual machines in your Azure Virtual Network to be able to access APIs that you've deployed to App Service, but you don't want those APIs available to everyone on the internet. Service endpoints still use the internet for their traffic, though. So if you really want to lock down your app service, there's a feature called Private Endpoints, which actually gives your app service a private IP address on the virtual network that you specify. If you've connected your on-premises network to Azure using VPN Gateway or ExpressRoute, that means that your on-premises users can access the app service privately, as if it's an internally hosted application, and the app service isn't available on the internet. In terms of outbound connections, your app service can reach only internet-hosted endpoints, so publicly accessible addresses, which doesn't include addresses of virtual machines in your own virtual network in Azure or your on-premises network, unless you give those virtual machines a publicly accessible endpoint, which you might not want to do for security reasons. So there's a feature called Hybrid Connections that lets you install a relay agent on-premises or in the cloud to allow that access. You might need to reach an on-premises database, for example. You can also use a feature called Virtual Network Integration that allows your app service to make inbound calls to resources in an Azure Virtual Network that's not routable from the internet. And when you have even higher security requirements, you can host your app services in an app service environment, which is a single-tenant deployment of the app service plan that runs in your virtual network. That gives you isolated and dedicated app hosting. We won't discuss app service environment any further in this course, but just know that it's an alternative to the multi-hosting app service that you typically use. Okay, so now you understand how Azure App Service provides a lot of features to host your web apps and APIs securely with low management overhead, and lots of connectivity options to use app services as part of a larger solution. But there are lots more features that will appeal to you as a developer. Let's talk about some of those next.